From the Mercy One studio.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
Good morning, I'm Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, Des Moines, Iowa, where we both work at Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show. I am the senior advisor to the president for mission initiatives and spiritual health, and also the director of our new up-and-coming Center for Human Flourishing. Sorry, my brain went blank there. Bud, what do you do at the old college?
I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs, and this confuses our friends because sometimes on our text thread, if you really make someone angry, they jokingly text me and say, "Can you fire Bo?" And I actually don't have that power.
That's right. Nor can I fire you.
It's probably better this way.
That's right. People get the idea that like authority works in universities like a straight line. Evidently, like it's like you're either in first place or 500th place. But I'm like, we're not even like on related parts of the org chart. Which, by the way, Bud, as an adult, I did not realize how much my life would be dominated by org charts.
Yeah, people see the org chart, and the only question they want answered is, "Can Bud fire Bo?" But no, we're like opposite sides of that stratosphere.
That's right. We're on different parts of the tree, the tree of organizational life.
Glad to be on the same tree, though. Good tree.
Yeah, one big tree, different branches. In fact, I have the I don't know if this is coveted. I have the unique dotted line thing, right? Like so, like in org charts, there's like direct, like this person to this person to this person, but then you have like dotted lines for people who are related to an office, but not. It's like in and of the office, but like scripture. But so, at any rate, I have a dotted line to the president. You have a straight line to the provost.
That's true.
Straight line to the provost sounds like a really awesome like R&B 80s album.
Exactly. My one of my specialties in terms of scholarship is ecclesiology, the study of the church. And I have to say, ecclesiology has nothing on org charts. Org charts are complex and unique, and there's a whole history there waiting to be uncovered.
That's right. Like, there's a way in which you go, oh, so, what's the org chart of the church? And you're like, well, there's the Pope, and then there's, like, just a lot of bishops.
Yeah.
Different types, but mostly just bishops.
You can get into some pretty fun stuff, like, I'm going to blank now that I'm on the radio. If someone's made a cardinal, they're often given a titular see. So It's like, what is it, like a diocese that no longer exists, or like an island in the ocean that no one's claimed?
Yeah, well, traditionally they gave them sees that were under. I mean, after the caliphates took over parts of old Christendom, right? But even it's weirder because cardinals will have suburbanate. So, like, all of these cardinals, like, dispersed across the world, actually have a church in Rome that's supposed to be theirs, and so they were making a big deal that the custom used to be, of course, that the cardinals were from Rome, and so that was their parish, as it were. But now people only coming in frequently, but I think they're starting up, some people are starting up the custom, again, of going and when they're visiting Rome to go preach at their church. So I always think it's funny because it's a bunch of, like, Roman Italians, and you're like... Here's like, I'm a New Yorker, but I'm a cardinal, so listen.
Yeah, I should know this off the top of my head, but you've got me thinking now. I need to go research what Newman's titular church is in Rome. Yeah, I know they gave him one, but...
Yeah, I can't believe on your big hubbubaloo tour in Rome they didn't take you by.
This is... Sometimes I overlook really basic facts, like my children's birthday, and which church belongs to Newman in Rome. Quasi belongs to him.
Yeah, no, and I should also point out before some stickler is going to like write into us. Of course, when it comes to the sort of the canonical church, that is an org chart that can like bend your mind about like who has like what sort of the complaint chain, as it were. But when it comes to ecclesiology, right, there's the Pope, and then there's the bishops in communion with the Pope, and that's important and relevant because we're actually going to be talking about the social good of communion today. Mm-hmm. So you thought Bud and I were just saying stuff, but actually masterfully setting up the show.
Yeah, I was speaking a little tongue-in-cheek. That ecclesiology can get complex, too, but actually the way that you phrase it, Bo, that's kind of focusing on the basics, which can be good sometimes. Like you're saying, like you can get into the weeds of what's a Monsignor and titular sees, etc., but remembering that kind of basic, God, Christ established one church, and there's sort of this basic structure. It's not a bad thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, well, things to keep in mind, speaking of people that set things up. We are underwritten by Mercy College of Health Sciences that makes this show possible. mchs.edu. Just got done with the fall semester, spring semester. Summer semester started. We're trucking along there, but waiting for people, reaching out for people to consider starting in the fall.
Yeah, we're joking about the complexity of org charts. Keeping track of Mercy College's calendar can be kind of complex because we've got several different things going on, but this is actually a real boon for those looking for a health sciences education. There's Mercy Plus, which is completely online, different nursing tracks, including an accelerated one that I think is really rigorous and intense, but if you're able to do it, you can finish in a short amount of time. So a lot of different options at mchs.edu.
Yeah, we just had Nurses Week a few weeks ago. So we really want to take one more time, not only to shout out to all our graduates, but all of them who are nurses, and especially during this last year, have shown the compassionate heart of Christ and the church's ministry of healing that we take special care of at Mercy College and is shown through our students. So Mercy College underwrites our show, mchs.edu, to go check that out. Well, Bud, I think we've set this up. What we're going to talk today, as we said, the social good of communion with the church. So not only what is it to me to be in communion, but why that is a social good, and specifically what we mean by social goods. We'll talk about the different sort of justices and different sort of goods, and why we can talk about that, the sort of nomenclature, the sort of vocabulary to talk about it best and see it as the church does. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Joining you this Wednesday. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Folks, if you want to reach us at The Uncommon Good, or you would prefer to leave messages for Iowa Catholic Radio in general, it's easy to do. Just use the zip-whip line. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150, the zip-whip line. Hashtag UCG for The Uncommon Good. If any of you Romologists want to help us out, maybe they can, or the Numenologists, they can throw that out about which church was the titular church of Cardinal Newman when he was a cardinal in Rome. If you know the answer, just text the zip-whip line. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150. Your questions answered. Your answers questioned? Maybe. The zip-whip line. 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150. This is The Uncommon Good. Joining you this Wednesday, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back right after this.
Hi, this is Joe Stopulus. Thank you to construction professionals for underwriting Man Up, Monday mornings at 9 on Iowa Catholic Radio. Construction Professionals, a Catholic family business built on a strong foundation. cpcustomhomes.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Catholic Women Now provided in part by Marr Security, a Catholic-owned family business providing security solutions for homes and businesses since 1953. Marr Security, 515-244-5660, marrsecurity.com.
The Iowa Catholic Men's Conference is Saturday, May 22nd at the Embassy Suites downtown, starting with Mass at 7 a.m. Speakers include Gary Dolphin and Tim Jameson, hosted by Joe Stopulus and John Leonetti. Learn more at iowacatholicradio.com/events.
There are millions of children that go hungry every day. Thank you to Skeffington's Formalware for supporting Mary's Meals. Their vision is that every child in the world should be able to receive at least one good meal every day in a place of education. MarysMealsUSA.org.
Thank you, Golden Rule Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling, for sponsoring my show. John Leonetti in the morning on Iowa Catholic Radio. Golden Rule, servicing Des Moines for over 15 years. They obey the rules to live by, especially the Golden Rule. Online at goldenrulephc.com.
Thank you, Ashworth Vision Clinic, for underwriting Dowling Catholic Sports 365 on Iowa Catholic Radio. Ashworth Vision Clinic online at ashworthvision.com. Ashworth Vision Clinic, 515-440-4610.
Thank you, Big Red Q Quick Print, for underwriting the sports report. Family owned and operated since 1980, Big Red Q Quick Print is a full-service print shop, ready to help you with all your printing needs with speed and accuracy. BigRedQ-DesMoines.com.
Thank you, Dental Associates, for supporting Dowling Catholic Sports 365. Dental Associates, addressing your smile, needs, and dreams. 515-225-6742. Online at Des Moines-DentalAssociates.com.
Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. Thank you for supporting Iowa Catholic Radio. We're glad you can join and be with us. So, Bud, today we're going to talk about the social good of communion. Now, of course, we could talk about communion as in the Eucharist and its social good. I think we've spoken of that in good measure. But we also want to talk about this. I don't know if I want to call it the secondary definition or meaning, but another meaning, of course, that it happens, the communion of the church happens because of the communion we have in the Eucharist. But if we're talking about communion with Rome, communion with each other, the idea that as in the technical sense, that ecclesiologically we are in communion with one another, and that's how we really talk about being Catholic. There's a sort of modern, I would even say Protestant maybe, understanding, at least post-Enlightenment, if not post-Reformation idea, that to belong to the church means that there's sort of propositions that you agree with, and you either say yes or no. But the longest, most foundational understanding about belonging to the church has to do with what we're talking about here with communion, which is to say I'm in communion with the Pope in Rome, the successor of the apostles, and then with my brothers and sisters in Christ here, where I'm at and throughout the world. And so communion, of course, is individually good, right? If you want to be a part of the Catholic Church, you should be in communion with it. But we really want to explore, I think, why it is a social good, and maybe use some of the old stories in the news, Bud, to bring up how this is an ever-pressing concern, and why we need to, as Catholics, be aware of it, pray about it, and do our part of being in communion in a real, concrete way.
Yeah, when we talked about the idea for this show, I thought it might be interesting over time. We don't have to knock this out in the month of May, but over time maybe do a series on the church. Each Sunday, we confess together that the church is one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. But like a lot of parts of worship in the liturgy, we maybe say those words and don't always reflect on them real closely. You know, there's been famous theologians throughout history. The first one that comes to mind for me is St. Robert Bellarmine, who referred to the church as a perfect society. And people hear that term, they're like, perfect society. Like, have you met Catholics?
That's
like,
right. Oh, yeah, what about last Sunday when blank happened?
Yeah. Or all, some of the rough news over the last couple decades. But what Bellarmine meant was that God has given the church all that it needs to be what he founded it to be.
Absolutely. If you don't mind me interrupting, but just to make this point, people will get confused because they'll hear, so families are I'm trying to remember exactly the right way that they put it. The family is the most basic social unit, but it's not a perfect society, because a perfect society is not a society with no flaws, which is what we're getting. That's the secondary definition of perfect. Perfect society means a society that is complete in and of itself, right? So it has all that it needs. A family doesn't. There has to be families of families in order for there to be a perfect society. But the church is a perfect society, like you said, comprised of all it needs. Okay, sorry for interrupting.
No, that's a really good point. And so when we think about unity in the church, it's a really substantive thing. This isn't like, not to pick on summer camp. I'm sure some of you out there are excited about summer camp coming up. But, gathering around the campfire and you sing Kumbaya and your stomach's full of s'mores and you feel
nauseated.
Literally and figuratively ooey and gooey inside. That's right. And it's like, oh, we're all one. Like, I'm thinking of an actual song, but I won't sing it for you. The Catholic Church, it's united across time and across space. And this is absolutely essential because I think we mentioned this a few weeks ago on the show, that sin impacts us not simply individualistically, but it has these social ramifications. And part of this is disunity among peoples. And if you look in the news today, you see around the world and in our own country ways in which communities try to organize themselves and create this unity that's been lost, whether that's through some sort of ethnic identity or nationalism. And some of these are goods. Like, shout out to John Leonetti. It's not a bad thing to be proud for being Italian, but like the ultimate unity that God desires for his people is the communion that we know in the church. And this is Eucharistic. It's hierarchical, not necessarily pyramidal per se, but it's hierarchical in that it has like this priestly order with a specific structure where God provides us spiritual fathers and mothers at every sort of like state in life. So the church, not the church, the world longs for this. But if you watch the news long enough, you see like it can't attain it. And the unity that it longs for is the unity that we know in the church.
One of the things that I think is great about this episode so far is people have seen the background, because you're right. Like, other than the interviews we have planned, we just planned the next 4 episodes.
You've got a series on your hands.
That's
folks.
right. So what Bud's referring to, just to make sure that people can make the connection, is traditionally the 4 marks of the church. The church is one, the church is holy, the church is Catholic, and the church is apostolic. And so the social good of communion directly deals with the good of the oneness, the mark of the church, that the church is one. So that even when we talk, like we did at the opening of the show for fun, about, there's these dioceses, there's these metropolitan, there's all these ways in which we can, so to speak, skin the cat as far as what needs to get done in an administrative way or even in a ruling way. But the oneness of the church and its communion is of all importance. That's why when we talk about the 4 marks of the church, holiness, of course, really important, but the oneness starts, right? And I think that that's something too, Bud, is that the 4 marks are not randomly distributed. It's not like an alphabetical order. If the church is not one, it can't be holy. If it's not holy, it can't be Catholic. If it's not Catholic, it can't be apostolic. And so the oneness, being in communion with the church, paramount of importance. So we're arguing that you can undermine the holiness of your life if you undermine communion with the church.
Yeah, my patron saint, Bo, is Ignatius of Antioch, and he was a 2nd century martyr, and he talks about schism, or breaking the communion of the church, as almost the greatest of sins. And we ask ourselves, how is schism, how is causing division such a great sin? Because we can think of other really grave evils, and on the surface it seems like, well, maybe this is further down the ladder. But as you're talking about, this is of paramount importance, and you see this all the way in the beginning from sacred scripture, where our Lord prays that his followers will be one just as he and the Father is one. If you think of the unity that the Son shares with the Father, that's almost mind-boggling. And so when we get later into the New Testament with some of St. Paul's epistles, he's always writing the faithful about this, and he's saying, maintain this communion unless you don't want me to show up and, help you to do so using my apostolic authority. And as time goes on, so many of the saints, I mentioned Ignatius of Antioch and others, this is really at the forefront of their minds. And I think about it this way, Bo, like, if you make an analogy between the church and the family, and as we all know, families have idiosyncrasies and, dare I say, problems. If that family doesn't maintain the essential unity that it knows through kinship, how will you ever deal with the problems? The problems are serious, but if the answer is like, I'm going to go set up a separate household, all of a sudden reform is impossible. And so, sometimes on the show, it might sound like I'm picking on some of these Protestant figures. We've talked about Luther and Calvin in the past. When you read their lives, you realize so many of their decisions were not driven by ill intentions. They didn't set out saying, like, I'm going to be a terrible person and wreck this whole thing. At the forefront of their mind was reform, but once they broke that communion, what they desired was no longer possible. And we can just say, empirically, sociologically, outside of the Catholic Church, unity is almost hopeless. It's not that there's not good things present in an individual congregation or community, but the kind of unity that we've been discussing, it's impossible to maintain without, for instance, the office of St. Peter, which our Lord established.
Well, and even if you think about the great figures in the church that are sometimes, held on a pedestal, and then I'll be honest, sort of like Gain said, like used to hammer a point that they're actually not making, when it comes to, insistent fire-breathing preachers of reform. You think of Catherine of Siena, for instance, confronting a pope, but her confrontation was about unity.
Yeah,
you go back, and the people who were willing to step up and put it all on the line to confront a pope was almost always things like, hey, you can't stay in Avignon because it precisely ruins unity. Because the longer you stay in Avignon, I know people are like, what is he talking about? But there's just one of the historical times that is famously said about a pope being confronted by a future saint. The idea was if you stayed in Avignon, you would seem like a puppet of the French king, and you will tear Christianity apart. You have to go back to Rome. You think about Paul confronting Peter about the Gentile converts and that issue. It was never a matter of like, I'm going to take my ball and go home. This was about unity. Are we not unified, we Jews and Gentiles? And so even when you start to get to point to reformers who actually did care about reform, but in some ways, like, the word is wrong because it sounds like you have to reformulate something. Yeah. And what they were going back was to pointing back to actually what doesn't need reform, the fact that we are unified, and if we are not one in the body of Christ, we have, like you said, no hope of changing what needs to be changed.
Yeah, the zeal of reformers like Catherine of Siena or St. Francis of Assisi was unmatched. The question was how they went about the work that they did, and they're the real paragons and examples that we look to.
They're the real MVP, to quote Kevin Durant.
Hall of Famers. So as folks are listening, I'm sure like one question that comes to mind is, this all sounds good and great. How does it start to intersect with my everyday life? And at the start of the conversation, Bo, you mentioned some of the current events, like the news that are out there around this topic. I think if you're someone like myself who's kind of a church news nerd, you may have heard of some of the conversations taking place among Catholics in Germany. So there, I guess, kind of speaking broadly, Bo, like synodality, the Germans right now are using the term synodality.
Right.
And I want to say up front, I have no problem with synodality. Gathering a synod.
Big fan of synodality.
Yeah. I mean, it comes from a Greek word meaning together. And throughout the history of the church, the leaders of the church have gathered councils and synods to discuss important issues or issues that were sort of under dispute or unclear. And one thing that's come up in the German conversations is the topic of marriage. And there's been this move among some German Catholics to say, can we bless same-sex unions? And Rome, the Holy Father, has already spoken out and said, any discussion you have around marriage, it has to be in coordination with what the church believes about that institution. Now, I mean, we don't have to only pick on Germans. It's fun to do so, but like you can look at all these different parts of the world and see kind of variations of this whole theme. So a couple years ago, we had on the show Dr. Tony Clark, who discussed how this plays out in China and the fact that the Chinese government over time has tried to appoint some of its own bishops. They would be like, quote unquote, patriotic bishops who would be chosen by the Communist Party of China. And Rome has said, no, this doesn't work. Like, it's absolutely essential that these leaders in your country are in communion with the entire church. And so Rome has wanted to say in that matter, that's a complex topic, and there's a lot of negotiations there. Here in America, I mean, I'll pass the baton to you in a few seconds here. One thing that comes to mind for me is, you know, this term like identity politics, and it plays itself out in different ways, but the ways that there might be cultural themes that become sort of pressing in our context, and in some ways I think Catholics can sort of lead with that in their public face. I think we always have to be taking those parts of our life and shining the light of church teaching and tradition and saying, is the way, like, are my own commitments in consonance with what the church believes?
Right. And on all of those, the content can make us actually lose the point about communion. So, for instance, in Germany, there is there's huge questions about, like, can you bless any sort of relationship? So it's not that you're even saying that marriage is okay. This is where the big debate is happening. Yeah. But the point to get at is to say, no, before we ever get to that, this is a church-wide thing. Like, so a random local synod can't... Is it synod or synod? I always feel like I'm just being, like, oaky when I go to the synod!
That might be potato,
okay.
Augustine,
yeah.
Augustine. I say synod, but I'm probably just lazy.
Synod. So, of course, this can't be decided by a random region. Okay, yeah. Same thing with the Chinese bishops issue. On one hand, you want to go, the Chinese government should have no say, right? Like, didn't we fight the investiture controversy on this? However, if like some sort of deal with the Chinese is the only way for people to have bishops so that they can be in communion, right? This is a difficult topic, right?
Yeah.
It can't be simply decided locally. Same thing when it comes to the United States. The big one in the news is about the document that the bishops, the USCCB, is writing about communion to politicians that publicly disagree with the church. And there's all sorts of, there's more than one side, to be honest, and I think we all know where most people would fall. But the question, like with Rome seeming to intervene, is not about you guys, we don't like what you decided. It's that you can't decide it, right? This is a church-wide issue. But so these are things where we're like, oh, unity means appropriately understanding that the church has to decide on things and not just like random pockets. But it also is flipped when it becomes very individual. There's all sorts of things that your bishop tells you that you may or may not think is like the best idea or not, but as long as it doesn't go about the faith, are you following it? Because doing what your bishop says is a local way to manifest unity. To be in communion with your bishop is to be in communion with the Pope. So it comes from both angles, right? Yeah. Are there issues that we would love to solve as Americans just because American Catholics deal with American things? Sure, but we're a church. But on the flip side, right, you might, in fact, I know in the modern era where we can like hear other bishops tell us things via Twitter, you might like better what another bishop says, but you are a Catholic here. And although I know, I'm not bad, I of all people will say, of course, there's been heroic people who have withstood even authority in the church to hold fast to the faith, right? That's like the story of the anti-Nestorians, all sorts of things. But if it's not a matter of faith, do we show docility and obedience to our bishop? Because by doing that, we, so to speak, incarnate communion here locally as well.
Yeah, it places a heavy responsibility on all of us, Bo, and I know we just have a few minutes before the break, but I'll say, each era has its own challenges. One serious challenge in our own context is you kind of intimated social media, and I'm not going to name any bishops by name, but this whole discussion around the vaccines and like the morality of like related there, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is the office that holds the authority, and I don't know what word I'm looking for, like it's the responsibility falls to them to address those questions for the sake of Catholics they've spoken. And you can get different Catholics, both ordained and sort of like public speakers, professional Catholics, I don't know the right term, who I guess in conscience are challenging the substance of that document. And we each have to answer ultimately to God for the responsibilities and the talents that have been given to us. But I share that example. I don't want to like get down that bunny trail today, but to say, it does place a kind of responsibility on all of us. And at the heart of it, I think, Bo, like we don't want to forget that we can talk about this after the break, but Catholic communion is not simply ascribing to a set of ideas.
Actually, yep.
But it's Eucharistic. And St. Paul gets at this when he says, we are one because, and if it's your first time reading the Bible, you might think he's going to say, again, we ascribe to the same creed or whatnot, but he says because we all partake of the same loaf.
Yep.
And that's why, that's frankly why weekly attendance at Mass is so essential. But once you see the interlocking nature between Eucharistic communion and the truth that we know and share because the Church, as the emissary of God, confirms it, we begin to see like the way that charity relates to this, the way like thinking with the Church is so essential, and the interlocking nature of both of those things.
No, I think your example with the CDF and everything like that is you can disagree in conscience, but it's not disagreeing with an idea. It's like disagreeing with your mom or dad. So you can, you're an adult, but you have to answer that. You have to have a different relationship to that disagreement than if you just disagreed with an idea. It's one thing to disagree with ideas that it's even as different to disagree with ideas your mom and dad have. But if your mom and dad, even as an adult, go, we love you, we care for you, this is what we think you should do. Even as an adult, if you're going to go no. You would address that no different than if it was just like a friend, a colleague, or just an idea. Now that we have to understand that although we are like trying all to be adults in Christ, we're also still always children in Christ. That's why we talk about the Holy Father. The obedience and docility is not to be doormats. It's not to not have a thinking faith. All these things. It's just to say, even in conscience, if you disagree, you are never disagreeing with simply an idea. You have to disagree with your father, your parent, and the respect necessary to do that. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, and we'll be back right after this. Folks, if you want to stay connected with Iowa Catholic Radio, easy to do. Just use our social media. I know, we're always worried about it, but if you want good social media, here is a platter of good, wholesome social media food. So you can go to iowacatholicradio.com, the original website, where you can listen live, donate, sign up for emails, regular email updates. Thank you. Gee whiz. Or see pictures and whatnot. You can also go to Facebook, friend us on Facebook, and then you can see all of our posts, Iowa Catholic Radio on Facebook. You can go to Twitter at IA Catholic Radio and then follow our tweets. You can also download Iowa Catholic Radio app anywhere that there's data, listen live, donate, etc., and also set up your Alexa to do the same. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, and we'll be back right after this.
The Iowa Catholic Men's Conference is Saturday, May 22nd at the Embassy Suites downtown, starting with Mass at 7 a.m. Speakers include Gary Dolphin and Tim Jameson, hosted by Joe Stopulus and John Leonetti. Learn more at iowacatholicradio.com/events.
Hi, this is Joe Stopulus. Thank you to construction professionals for underwriting Man Up, Monday mornings at 9 on Iowa Catholic Radio. Construction Professionals, a Catholic family business built on a strong foundation. CPCustomHomes.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Catholic Women Now provided in part by Marr Security, a Catholic-owned family business providing security solutions for homes and businesses since 1953. Marr Security, 515-244-5660, PermarSecurity.com.
There are millions of children that go hungry every day. Thank you to Skeffington's Formalware for supporting Mary's Meals. Their vision is that every child in the world should be able to receive at least one good meal every day in a place of education. MarysMealsUSA.org.
Thank you, Ashworth Vision Clinic, for underwriting Dowling Catholic Sports 365 on Iowa Catholic Radio. Ashworth Vision Clinic online at ashworthvision.com. Ashworth Vision Clinic, 515-440-4610.
Thank you, Golden Rule Plumbing, Heating, and Cooling, for sponsoring my show. John Leonetti in the morning on Iowa Catholic Radio. Golden Rule, servicing Des Moines for over 15 years. They obey the rules to live by, especially the Golden Rule. Online at goldenrulephc.com.
Here's your forecast on Iowa Catholic Radio. The next couple of days look fair with mild temperatures, and then we have a low moving in Thursday night and Friday. That'll bring us some showers through the upcoming weekend. For now, 65 and mostly sunny through the afternoon. Low 40s and partly cloudy overnight, and then we get a sunny day tomorrow, warming up to about 68. Maybe a shower on Thursday night, and then scattered showers on Friday, 63. I'm meteorologist Steve Hamilton on Iowa Catholic Radio.
Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the show. We have our impromptu four-part series, besides when we actually have interview people, where we're going to talk about the four marks of the church. The church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Today, talking about the oneness of the church and the social good of communion. Bud, really, you came up with this idea, this morning, and then you've really just filled out the rest of the time for us. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts about how the impromptu series is going so far?
I think it's going okay. Yeah, sometimes when we get into some social issues on the show, I feel like a little bit out of my league. So when you gave me an opening to suggest a topic, I was like, we'll talk about the church. And I think I have a few things to say. Before jumping back into it, though, Bo, during the break, a question was coming to mind for you. And I like asking you questions on the radio, but because you can't just blow them off. If you blow them off, people are like, oh, he just ignored Bud. But right now, if you could only have one of these three things, would you want toilet paper, lumber, or fuel?
Oh, wow. Oh, This reminds me of like Settlers of Catan, but it's like real life. So
well, and keep in mind the state of our country where you could still go hunt the other two down. But like, which one's most immediately pressing for you?
I mean, probably gas. Unfortunately, to say that's like how we've ordered society. I don't know if I'm up for hiking to Mercy College every day and back.
Well, right now I am happy to live in a city like Des Moines because, like cities like D.C. or New York can have some pretty serious traffic jams. And I know on the East Coast, like the fuel is a little more scarce. So I would just hate to be sitting on one of those highways or whatever, wondering, watching the needle go down.
That's right. Yeah, and I just saw this morning one of our friends put a text that from the health authority or something somewhere on the East Coast, it said, a reminder, don't put gasoline in plastic bags. So if there's anything else that you need to learn today from the uncommon good, do not put gasoline in plastic bags.
It's like the rule of St. Benedict where it says, like, don't sleep with the blade. You just know...
someone did it.
Yeah, so the health officials had to say, let's cut this out. No, but actually, talking about society in general, I think this is a nice segue to the first half of the show. We tried to really get in deep to the theology of the church, and especially this idea of unity or communion. As I mentioned early on, society longs for this. I mean, I think it's a good that all humans want to know. And it's been interesting for me, Bo, as I've gotten older, to watch as Christianity as faith has somewhat waned in our culture. I think you've seen this kind of vacuum created where more and more people are turning to, if it's no longer faith or the church that provides this unity for them, where can they find it? And there's some less harmful ways of looking for that. I think the way that people feel really passionate about their particular sports team kind of becomes a way they find community. Certainly in recent years, we've seen, unfortunately, the rise of extremist groups united around maybe racist ideas or whatnot. But this is, we were talking during the first segment about this communion that God provides for his church, but how it puts a kind of onus on us. When we live this out faithfully, I think it can be a real witness to the world about, like, this is, hopefully when they look at the church, they see an image of what they long for themselves.
Yeah, I think that it's important to realize that all heresies come from the church, and not like organization of the church. I mean us. When we, the church, don't live up to the grand calling that we've been called to as children of God through our baptisms, there will always be a heresy that stems from it trying to, so to speak, overcorrect that. I mean, you go back to the very most basic things like the Gnosticism of the first century, and in many ways this is to be as charitable to reading some of the people who think they like the Gnostics often think that there's just goofy ways that they have to make weird compromises in their mind to make that work, but to be more charitable than they usually are in reading Christianity itself. When people say that they think the material world is fake and worthless and that only the spiritual world exists, oftentimes it's because they're living through horrible situations, right? Mm-hmm. So, like, why would I want to be a dualist? Well, it's easily to say, if I can dismiss all the pain and suffering that I've had, it's easy to do. But that's because Christians have been unwilling to carry people's crosses with them, right? So if we're not willing to carry others' crosses, they're very likely to be dualists. Okay. Well, the same thing happens with the oneness of the church. Where does the modern nation state come from, bud? But it comes from the bloody fields of the religious wars. Now, I think it's very important. We've had people like Dr. William Kavanaugh point out that there's been a lot of fake news, to use a modern term, about how religion caused those wars.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the case that religious people allowed themselves to get sucked into political battles, that because, as Christians, they allowed themselves to do so, it kind of cut the anchor for a lot of people. They no longer saw the faith as the thing that can anchor or moor or be the foundation of a society. So what you start to see after things like the 30 Years' War is people go, okay, well, we'll be Christians and it's good for us individually, but socially there has to be something to replace it. And so the modern nation state is a response to Christians not being Christian. And the continual temptation to make the nation state be the source of unity for a group of people. And I mean, but that everything from like sort of the most internationalist, like liberal regimes to the most ethno-nationalist fascist groups, they all talk about unity, right? Because they know, like you said, they want unity. and they see that the church has talked about it, but where we failed, they take our language and they bastardize it. And that's what we're living in the face of, is false unity. And we as Christians have abdicated our role in witnessing to true unity.
This is where it's so important, I think, to be rooted in revelation and in sacred scripture. Not revelation like the specific book in the New Testament, but what God has revealed about himself and about the church. Bo, I'm blanking on the author, but I saw an interesting article a couple of years ago where the author was kind of pointing out that some of the atrocities that we've witnessed in the world, like, say, the Holocaust leading up to or during World War II, was nation states, as you mentioned, or people groups trying to seize the election that God gave to Israel. So Israel was God's special
David Goldman, I think.
Yeah, it was probably Goldman.
Yep.
And the God choosing the nation of Israel, or the people descending from Abraham, to be his chosen people. And that's the shape of salvation history. But we even see this in the church. You know, I picked on Luther at the start of the show, but these arguments or these sorts of situations have taken place long before Luther. So you think about, I think, Bo, this is like 3rd or 4th century, probably 4th century. You have the Donatist controversy. Mm-hmm. And in the wake of some of the persecutions against the church, there's a group, again, I think with very good intentions, who they want to maintain the holiness of the church. This second mark that we want to talk about later on in the month, they want to maintain the holiness of the church, and they say those who caved during the persecution and maybe handed over Bibles or whatever when soldiers came to the door, like, they shouldn't be let back into communion, or they certainly shouldn't be ordained clerics, you know, operating as pastors in the church. And the church landed in a different place. It said, you know, no, the weeds grow up with the wheat, and there's a certain sense in which we allow God to sort things out. We don't take apostasy or sin in the church lightly, but the kind of strictness that the Donatists called for was too strong. And that's where we're saying, like, we don't want you to hear on the show today, Bo and Bud don't care about some of these problems that we see around us, but there's a humility, a docility, a certain patience that comes with confronting the very real problems.
The unity and oneness with Christ will win out more than our efforts. And you think about that in terms of the Donatists. You're exactly right. I mean, in many ways, that's I didn't even think about this. The whole thing in the nutshell is the Donatist, in the end, said the solution to dealing with what the persecutions wrought is the individual. That each individual maintain, like you said, the holiness, the faith, etc. And what the church said is, like, look, the offices of the church, the sacraments of the church, those all exist in Christ. And so the individuals can wax and wane in holiness or worthiness, but the church is always worthy because its head is Christ. So the priesthood can be, so to speak, the office can be granted to an unworthy person and it not destroy the office. Mm-hmm. And I can understand how in the face of the persecutions that can sound like, okay, well, here's clerics, like, backing up other clerics. It wasn't quite like that. There was other geopolitical issues very much involved when you talk about what was going on in that time in church history. But theologically, you see the brilliance of what is being pointed upon. It's like, look, the church is going to last a long time, and it is going to have very unworthy people in its ranks. But what Christ has established in the priesthood and in the sacraments will never change. This goes back to the perfect society idea, yeah. Right? Is that it's not a perfect society because it's made of perfect people, but it's a society that persists on its own even if we don't carry out what we're supposed to. And actually, that's the great hope of the church is, the joke in Oklahoma is always, if you don't like the weather, just wait 15 minutes and it will change. But, if you don't like the church as it is, don't worry. Just wait, 50 years, and it will be different people. And I know that can sound defeatist, but it actually, to your point, I think you said, it shows not only hope, but a sure grounding in fortitude, that we can actually, like Christ, outlast any sort of suffering that the world might try to throw our way.
I think all of what we've been saying ties into evangelism as well. When we think about sharing the gospel or inviting our friends and family members into the church, sometimes using kind of a modern mindset, we think it's a competition where it's like, leave behind, if you like Islam, you're really going to love Christianity, and like leave behind this kind of like, it's framed almost like inferior versus superior. It's sort of, again, like in terms of the way that we might think about like the Cardinals are better than the Cubs.
I mean, yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, but really when we share the gospel, when we share the truth that we know in Jesus Christ and invite people in this fellowship, we're saying there's these gifts that God has provided. They're only known through the Catholic Church. So this longing for unity that you have to just choose one can only be known fully in the Catholic Church. Now, I don't want to sound too wishy-washy. I mean, if you're coming from a different faith, there's obviously like ideas that you will probably have to let go and like in humility say, I used to think this about God. I now recognize this. But it really is, like, even if you look at the documents of Vatican II, it says the gifts and graces that we see in other communities, they find their proper home and they're known most fully in the Catholic Church. So I've started to think, like, this can change the way that you talk to folks about Catholicism. I had this kind of several years ago, sort of like convert zeal, where it's like, I'm going to, it ended up being sort of like Bud being a jerk on Twitter or something. Like, I'm just going to use these ideas and sort of like ram over people's heads. But I've started to think more like, my uncle or whoever who I disagree with, it's less important that I suddenly like finally convince him to see the truth and, finally like have this seal-tied argument that's going to do the trick. The way that I think about it is I'm inviting him into, not to sound too sentimental, but a party. Like it's the wedding feast of the Lamb. And so, each week at Mass, I'm blown away by the fact that Christ comes to meet us under the signs of ordinary bread and wine. I mean, it's just fair to say, like, that sacramental gift is known in the Catholic Church in a way that it's not known in these communities of friends that I know, like these communities that they're a part of. And so there's a lot more that could be said there, but I think this idea of like recognizing the gifts that God has given us through the Church and then inviting others to share and to participate in those.
Yeah, to be in communion with them, to partake of them. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by one of my favorite authors of all time. So Bernino, who wrote Diary of a Country Priest, he's talking specifically about reform, but just like you said, this also has to do with even evangelization. We constantly get bogged down and act like the church operates in ordinary means, right? So we go, I'll make a really airtight argument and it will make someone convert. And you're like, well, no, Christ makes people convert. And your prayer and your sacrifices will do just as much. But that sounds like we're trying to put ourselves out of a job because we're both teachers. But of course, it really just makes us understand that teaching is something different. Teaching is never the instrumental means that will make someone become Catholic or something. It's always about removing obstacles in the way, right? So like if you have an error, that can make you not open and susceptible to the spiritual movement of Christ, right? So the ordinary means that is teaching is about clarifying and clearing so that the supernatural means can act upon your soul. I have converted no one ever, but I have maybe had the chance to make that conversion at least easier, if not possible, by removing error. Reform in the church is the same way. There's all sorts of practical things we should do just as humans, but the practical things will never be what actually changes or quote-unquote reforms the church. So I'm going to quote him here, and he's a talker.
Yeah.
It is a fact of experience that nothing can be reformed in the church by ordinary means. Whoever attempts to reform the church by such means, the same means by which one would reform a temporal institution, not only fails in his enterprise, and here's the kicker, but ends up infallibly outside the church. I say that by some kind of tragic fate, he finds himself outside of the church before anyone has taken the trouble to exclude him. This is the whole point about unity. He renounces its spirit, its dogmas. He becomes its enemy without hardly realizing it, and if he attempts to turn back, each step takes him further away. So what should we do instead? So he has someone in mind. One can only reform the church by suffering for her. One can only reform the visible church by suffering for the invisible church. One cannot reform the church's vices except by pouring out example of the most heroic virtue. It is possible that St. Francis of Assisi was no less disgusted than Martin Luther by the debauchery and simony of prelates. It is even certain that they made him suffer more cruelly. But he did not defy iniquity or try to confront it. He threw himself into poverty, plunged himself into it as much as he could, as if it were the fountain of healing and purity. Instead of trying to rip the hands of from the hands of the church her ill-gotten goods, he filled her with invisible treasures, and under the guidance of this beggar, the heaps of gold and riches begin to flower like a hedgerow in April. Can I say, in the hope of being understood better by some readers, that the church does not need critics but poets? When there is a crisis in poetry, what is important is not to denounce the bad poets or even to hang them, but to write beautiful verse, to reopen the sacred fountains of inspiration, end quote. And I think that is, when we talk about the social good of communion, it's not something you manufacture because, of course, one individual can't create unity. Unity, by definition, and this is, I actually meant to say this way earlier, but I'll say it now. You know, when we talk about justice in Catholic social tradition, there's three types. There's communitive justice, distributive justice, and then social justice, this very oft misunderstood third term. Communitive justice just means communicated justice, so the justice of contracts. You and I come to an agreement, and we're either give to each what they're owed by what we say or not. Distributive justice is when there's a resource that can only be enjoyed if it is somehow given among different people, but your enjoyment is individual. So, for instance, when it comes to like a river, right, and distributing its water so that people can drink, it has to be distributed, right? We can't leave it to individuals to just simply go to the individual, etc. Social justice is that justice which can only be enjoyed in community. By definition, it can't ever be enjoyed individually unless other people enjoy it. And Bud, communion is the paramount social justice issue. Yeah. We either all have it or we don't. And so communion and being in communion with the Pope, with Christ, with each other, just like Bernino pointed out, it's not a matter of us like dotting our I's and crossing our T's. It has to come back to this sort of poetic, this prayerful way that we try to reform to get back into communion with each other.
Yeah, I didn't really think about the timing of the show, Bo, but it's kind of a beautiful thing that Pentecost is coming up.
Absolutely.
Not this Sunday, but
we meant to, yeah.
I'd love to say that's the case. And you think about Pentecost in contrast to the Tower of Babel. You know, the Tower of Babel, what was wrong with what the folks tried to do there, with what the people tried to do there? You know, like they knew that sin had caused this division, and they were going to structure this unity around this, tower that was built to the heavens, and yet God scattered them and confused their languages. And I think it really goes back to, Bo, there's a line in Genesis there that says, like, it was about their pride and their ambition, and they were going to build a unity apart from God. We know that the unity that God desires us to have can only be given through the sending of His Spirit and through communion in the church, as we've been talking about. And to me, that's really freeing. Like, to be a little, I mean, I don't mean this flippantly, but like you and I could not end the show today and celebrate the Mass. We would need a priest here. And the faith is given to us at baptism. Like, we accept this gift that existed before we were born and will exist long after we die. And the communion in the church, we can only know that through like these means that God has provided. And so, like in some ways that sounds like a heavy responsibility, because it's like, well, I've got to do these various things to be a good Catholic or whatever. But it's freeing because it's not something that I'm going to produce on my own. It truly is a grace. It's this reality, like I said, that preceded us, that will persist after us. And, each Sunday morning, each day, if we have the time, we have the glorious opportunity to experience this substantially and viscerally.
Yeah, and as converts, we both, it's important that we were asked at Easter when we came into the church to confess what the church teaches, not do I agree with it.
Yeah.
Unity is prior to acceptance. Well, we got to wrap up. Great show, Bud. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, our families, city, state, nation, world, solar system, whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week. But if folks want to be in communion with us and in great unity, pray together with us, how might they do so?
I'm going to do this in order today. So you can pray the rosary. You hear it on air at 5:30 in the morning. That's followed by the Angelus at 6 a.m. 9:30 a.m., the rosary is broadcast again. 3 in the afternoon, there's the Divine Mercy Chaplet. And then you can wrap up your day at 9:30 p.m. praying the rosary. And also a quick reminder that the rosary prayers are available through our app anytime, anywhere.
And folks, speaking of unity, it's why it's important when we think of Iowa Catholic Radio to not think of it simply as individuals who get shows and talk. We're not just unconnected sort of different people trying to just get jobs done. This is a unified thing. It is a ministry. We do this together. And so you, all listening right now, are an important part of that unity that make this possible. We are able to do what we do, sending out the words of Christ as we do on the radio because of your prayers, because of your volunteer work, but also materially supporting us. And you can do that by calling 515-223-1150 or texting as well. You can donate that way, or you can go to Iowa Catholic Radio, hit the donate button. And also, as we've said before, if you download the Iowa Catholic Radio app, there's a donate button there. But your material support allows this unified ministry that we all have together to do what we need to do. Speaking of things we're doing, Iowa Catholic Radio events, you can find all those events on iowacatholicradio.com. But the upcoming ones, the Iowa Catholic Men's Conference is Saturday, May 22nd at the Embassy Suites downtown, starting with Mass at 7 a.m. Speakers include Gary Dolphin and Tim Jameson, hosted by Joe Stopulus and John Leonetti. JJ.
That's a powerful tandem.
The power tandem, yes. The Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic, presented by the Liturgical Institute, is Wednesday, June 23rd at Legacy Golf Club in Norwalk, Iowa. Shotgun start at 10 a.m. And then the Iowa Catholic Radio Foundation welcomes country artist Lori Morgan to the Horizon Events Center July 15th with Jesse Keith Whitley and Eli Ager. Learn more about reserving a table at celebratecountry.org. Bud, make sure to go out and enjoy the nice weather. And hopefully, it sounds like we're getting rain this weekend, so you should be able to, you've lived through some droughts yourself.
I know. I hope these don't follow me, and I brought one to Des Moines. But, yeah, well, in the past, I've seen God answer some prayers in miraculous ways regarding that matter as well, so certainly something to keep in mind.
Pray for rain, folks. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.